Welcome. There we go. My name is Emily Pinkowitz. I'm the Interim Director of Public Programming, Education, and Community Engagement at Friends of the Highline. And I'm so excited to welcome you to the second annual series of Beyond the Highline Talks. How many of you have been to our talks before, just out of curiosity? Oh, great. Welcome back. So you already know you're in for a treat. Last year's talks featured conversations about the Bloomingdale Trail in Chicago, various public spaces in Detroit, the Low Line on the New York's Lower East Side, and the Lafayette Corridor in New Orleans. And this year we're featuring two more adaptive reuse projects. Tonight's talk, which is the Reading Viaduct in Philadephia, and September 23rd's talk, which will be Fresh Kills Landfill in Staten Island. We are also hosting a special panel discussion on issues of equity in parks development, and that will be with Peabody Award-winning radio broadcaster Majora Carter, who I'm really excited about, and urban strategist and former mayor of Bogota, Enrique Peñalosa. So I hope that you'll come back for those talks. We have a robust calendar of public programs throughout the year. We have over 450 public programs over the course of the year. So make sure you take a moment to sign up if you haven't already, so you can get on our mailing list and be entered into a raffle that we'll pull at the end of the night. I am so excited to welcome the two speakers and also to welcome Robert Hammond, our executive director and one of the co-founders of Friends of the Highline, who will be introducing tonight's talk.
Thank you all for coming, and I want to make one more plug for the talk with Majora Carter and Enrique Peñalosa. Both of them are so interesting and talking about a little bit of an issue that a lot of people we get uncomfortable talking about, which is issues of race and money and class and parks. So I think it'll be a really interesting conversation. I hope you all will come back for this. How many of y'all know some things about the Philadephia project that we're going to see tonight? Oh, good. We got a pretty good. Well, they'll give you an overview, but there's just a lot of parallels to what is happening there to here. And even their railroad ceased running in 1980s. Ours was in 1980. I don't know the exact date of theirs. Theirs is about 4.7 miles long, which is a little longer than ours. And tonight we're going to hear from Leah Murphy and Paul Levy. And Leah is the senior associate with Interface Studio, a Philadelphia-based urban design and planning firm honored with many awards I won't go into. And since its very early stages as a nonprofit, Leah's worked to formalize and really advocate for the vision of Friends of the Rail part, playing an integral role of where it's gotten today. And Paul is the founding chief executive of Philadelphia's Center City District, which is sort of, I think, like our BIDS here, which is a $20 million downtown management district, which does all kinds of things to keep that area nice. And Paul also serves on the board of many organizations and very involved in sort of the civic life of Philadelphia. And we're going to begin with Paul, who's going to present the plans for the Business Improvement District's versions of this area for a 0.6-mile elevated stretch at 9th Street. And then Leah's going to speak on the behalf of Friends of Rail Park, which wants to preserve the viaduct's historical character and the existing sort of self-seeded landscape, and advocate for a continuous 3-mile park and recreation path, similar to, but one of the things people always ask me is, are they just trying to build another Highline? And that's what I love about both of these visions, and a lot of the visions we heard from last year, is not just trying to replicate what we do, but do something different that takes into account their own structure, their own neighborhood, what the needs of the city are. So I'm excited to hear the plans, and I also want to just make a plug for our Highline food. We have great food. The reason I'm sitting in the back is I'm actually eating my dinner while I hear part of this presentation. So thanks for coming.
Good. Well, good evening. I'm Paul Levy from Philadelphia. I'm really delighted to be here. Just A little bit of background, I went to Columbia in the late 1960s and early 70s when there was still a West Side Highway, and this was an industrial district. So one, it's remarkable to see how much this area has changed, but having been on the High Line now over the last 3 years, just how much other activity is going on around. So we are so impressed with what you've accomplished here, and it's obviously inspired many of us in many other cities. As you heard, it's going to be a two-part presentation talking about two different pieces and how they come together of both an elevated and a depressed portion of a viaduct in Philadelphia. I'm going to talk about both the background of this project, a little bit about our own organization, which is a business improvement district, how we got involved and how we see this area developing, and then Leah will pick up and take us across the street, if you will, to another portion of the viaduct. So this is an elevated portion. It's just north of the central business district of Philadelphia. It's in the area where that arrow is located, so we have a very dense 280,000 person employee downtown with a very expanding and vibrant residential area that's grown by about 20% over the last 2 decades. This is just north of that area in an expanding residential industrial area near the business district, but also in what had been a former industrial district. It's just north of our expanding Chinatown community, and there are a lot of issues we've had to work through between two different visions for that area. This is a view looking south from the viaduct. You can see the skyline of the city in the background. The Reading Viaduct on the east side of Broad Street, as you can see, is just under 7 acres and a little under a mile in length, and it has two components. The western or eastern branch is still owned by the Reading Railroad Company's successor company, Reading International, who's now in the movie theater business. They built this viaduct as a company in the late 19th century, continued all the way through till 1984, when a new railroad station made this portion of the viaduct obsolete. The left-hand portion of this, which is only about 30,000 square feet, which is the most advanced part of the project, was purchased by our regional transit agency, SEPTA, and had originally been planned for a rail line that is no longer going to be built. And then Leah will talk about the piece that starts in the dotted red line, which is the underground portion of this. So there is a vision of an integrated, elevated, and depressed portion. This was, as you heard, like yours, a former industrial rail line, but also for us a passenger rail line. The blue line is our Broad Street. Leah will talk more about Baldwin Locomotives, the largest railroad manufacturing company in North America, which was served by this, and then you'll see the Reading portion in the lower area. The trains originated out of a train station that still exists on Market East, the Reading Head House, and underneath that today we have a very vibrant farmers market. This remained in active use until 1984, when that new Underground Railroad connection made it obsolete, and it's been converted into the gateway to our modern convention center. The convention center is the white building in the foreground, and an elevated portion of this was demolished to make way for a truck ramp to come into the convention center, and the viaduct today starts where I've circled over there on the far right. So the viaduct today starts just north of Vine Street between 11th and 12th Street. It's a location that provides extraordinary views of the downtown. It splits in half, and the left-hand portion, which is most advanced, is owned by a regional transit agency. The right-hand portion, like your High Line, curves across the grid. And so it gives you this positioning over different streets. It gives you very unique views of landmarks, of iconic bridges, and of endangered buildings. So you get to see the city from a totally different angle. It's in very close proximity, as is yours, to older industrial buildings because it was the delivery system for all the industries that were there. So the viaduct is sometimes 10 to 15 feet from buildings, sometimes 7 to 8 feet from various buildings. Many of those buildings have already been converted to condos, lofts, businesses, artist studios. Others are in the process of being renovated, but there are a huge number of vacant and underutilized buildings within this area. Some of them are positioned to have great views, and the viaduct itself terminates then up at what's our Fairmount Avenue. During the last 20 years, it returned to natural life, lots of growth on it that occurred, and it became, every student in every architectural program in the region has done a study of the viaduct, and we had years and years of studies. The real work here began, and I'm delighted Sarah McEnany's here. She and John, very much inspired not only by the viaduct itself, but by the work here, organized the Reading Viaduct project and began in 2003 to advocate for this project. They have led thousands of tours, only one or two which are probably legal, right? None of them which are legal. So lots of people have toured this, and that's been an interesting challenge. But it's inspired many, many people. We're a business improvement district. Those you can see our boundaries. We became involved in 2009 and 10. I'll just flip through. We are like your bids. We do cleaning, we do security. We started to do landscape improvements, directional signs, lighting, and have really focused on animating our city center in a way to make it a really exciting place. We started to move into park development in 2008 with the renovation of a derelict park. We've continued as part of a broader strategy, and we see parks as an amenity for workers and residents. Most recent project for us was a major children's park, which we opened just last year, that we created a great little place within the city, and what we thought was a boat pond for well-behaved children became a swimming pool very quickly. But the amenities and the importance of these for residents, we saw as something very, very important. Our biggest project to date is a major renovation of the west side of City Hall into a transit gateway, a new green space, new fountains, new public art, a place that will be places for public markets and winter ice skating. And so we're very committed to improving parks, and this one will open next summer. So if you look at Philadelphia, and I'll do this very quickly now, Center Square is where our Dilworth Plaza, the original William Penn plan had 4 public parks. The viaduct begins in the circle area and goes to the left and to the right. This is an area in which 42% of the residents here work in the downtown, so as a downtown business improvement district, we see this as a place where our workforce lives. Our first consultant team looked at this in 2010 just to document the various components of the viaduct, to understand what the conditions were, because Photoshop's wonderful, but until you understand what's underneath the soil, you really don't know what the cost will be. And so at the time, there were proposals to knock it down. And so we assessed all of the environmental contaminants, and we found that it would be $50 million to demolish the viaduct, half of which was to deal with contaminated waste. We then took our inspiration from here in the High Line, worked with your organization here and the staff here, but we clearly said we didn't want the Mercedes-Benz that you built here. That was a kind of point of pride. We love what you have, but it needs to be authentic Philadelphia in many ways. And so we envisioned a jogging path, landscape walkways, an elevated place. But to me, the fundamental takeaway I had from your viaduct is it's not so much a connecting path as it is an amenity for a neighborhood, an attraction that does draw tourists, but that it's a central anchoring park for a neighborhood, and that's the vision that's really inspired us. It is the only potential green space in this portion of the city, and as this map, all the red dots show recent development, and what you see is a total void, an absence, a hole in the donut where development has not occurred because the viaduct itself is such a blighting influence. But as I said, it offers great views of the downtown, and we discovered it was actually cheaper to renovate it than demolish it. That became a threshold point where we said it makes more sense to save it, and the environmental costs in capping and covering it were far less than the $25 million disposal cost. Not so important for tonight, but for the project, the Chinatown community had advanced in a vision that not only should there be renovation of vacant lofts and reuse of vacant land, but their plan initially in 2004 called for the demolition of portions of this so new housing could be built. And one of the important studies that we did as part of this project is look at the triangular parcels to confirm that affordable housing for Chinatown could be built on triangular parcels adjacent to the viaduct without taking it down. And that was a real breakthrough point because it was knock it down versus preserve it, and now it's what's the appropriate way to develop next to it. So we worked out ways we could develop on and adjacent to the viaduct and connect to it, and the city then did a comprehensive plan for the area that said market rate, affordable housing, we want both. And with that, really, I think there's been a lot of consensus about moving forward. Most importantly, to demolish it, the improvement in value was 1 to 4%. To renovate it, there was a much greater impact from the real estate side. So we are in the final stages of negotiating with Reading, and I'll do very quickly now what we're on the verge of building. We have focused on just that SEPTA-owned portion, the transit agency portion, and we have a team that has just completed work that takes just the area that I've highlighted in red, and it's an area that, unlike yours, actually starts at grade and then slowly comes up to grade and ends at a stopping point. So our goal was to do a planning process with the community in which the basic message was respect the industrial character. We don't want something totally modern. We want to capture the industrial past. We want to make it uniquely Philadelphia, priding ourselves on not being like New York, but creating a backyard space for the people who live there. So the original vision of this was not a tourist amenity, but an amenity for families, for artists, for people with kids in the surrounding neighborhood, but make it expandable to connect to the portions to the east and the west. And so the plans that have now been completed connect to our Broad Street and envision a gateway that starts at grade, and there is a trolley car that's been there illegally as a diner for 25 years, which will become a formal part of the entranceway. As I said, it starts at grade where it used to be an industrial entrance, and we're creating a community meeting space here using the elevated portions as planters to fill in, and then where it goes over the street to create new stairways and to do specifically lighting at nighttime because of the concern of what the conditions might be underneath there. The whole theme is very generous landscaping with curving trails, taking portions of this and putting in wooden benches that recapture the spirit of the former railroad ties. And then as you move towards this end portion, to put all the benches as you've done to position good views out over the streets. And then at the end, or the initial end, we wanted to do these giant backyard swings, which will be made out of sort of industrial style material, and they'll become a sitting place where you can sit and swing and look out over the street, and it will mark a kind of terminus point for the first phase before we break through into phase 2. So this is reasonably not a $35 million project, but a $7 to $8 million phase 1. We have construction documents complete at this point. We're in the process of getting all city approvals and starting the fundraising process. So we're looking to 2014, maybe 15 for start of construction. And our most important issues, which the neighborhood is focused on now, is putting in place the maintenance mechanism. Because any of you know who do a project like this, raising the money to build it is only step 1. It's knowing how to maintain it at a high standard. So we're looking at a business improvement district, traditional fundraising, but for us, this will be the first step in what we think will be a project that will be inspired by this project, but in many ways very different. Let me turn it now over to Leah to talk about the next phase.
Hey everyone, I'm Leah Murphy. I am from a board member of Friends of the Rail Park. This is actually a graphic that we developed showing a number of these rails to trails, urban rails to trails projects in different places around the country at the same scale. So I thought it'd be useful to start out by showing this to you just so you can get a sense of how our site compares to the High Line, both in terms of length and width. So many of you probably are aware that the High Line is just shy of 1.5 miles long, and the majority of it was 2 rails wide. Our rail park in Philadelphia, what we propose to be the entirety of the rail park is just shy of 3 miles, and the majority of it had 4 rail lines side by side. So it's a much bigger site than the High Line. And it's also interesting to kind of look at their different geographies and compare to something like the Bloomingdale Trail, which is so flat and straight. So Friends of the Rail Park was founded in 2010. We're a very small, all-volunteer organization. Really, what we're advocating for a 3-mile continuous linear park and recreation path that includes the site that many people call the Reading Viaduct, which is what Reading Viaduct Project has been advocating for over 10 years. And now we are very lucky to have the efforts of Paul Levy and Center City District to help bring that towards implementation. So I'm just going to go into like the different parts as we see them, and I won't go into depth on the Ninth Street branch because you've just heard a lot on that piece by Paul. But as Paul mentioned, the Ninth Street branch is the elevated portion. It was formerly a passenger rail line. It's 0.6 miles long. And also, as Paul mentioned, many people who live and work in this neighborhood, the Callow Hill and Chinatown North neighborhood, recognize the viaduct is really the only potential green space that exists in that area. It's a very hardscaped landscape in Callow Hill especially. It's really the only swath of green if you can see it poking over the retaining wall. Unfortunately, the previous photos are a little outdated, and this is what you see today when you go up on top of the viaduct. Sadly, at the beginning of last year, the successor company of Reading International scrapped the rails, which is something that made us very sad because we really saw the rails as a historic element that we would like to have integrated into the future design of the Ninth Street branch. But fortunately, you see that there are these catenary supports. After the passenger rail line was electrified, they put up these kind of square structures that held the electrical power lines. And there are many other historical elements that we would love to preserve, fencing and other things, to help tell the story of that passenger rail line. The city branch, as Paul mentioned, is a historic freight rail line that at one time served as the lifeblood of one of the world's most heavily industrialized corridors. It's about 2.2 miles long, and just to give you a sense of how it looked when it was being constructed, it existed before it was depressed below street level, but there was a lot of conflict of different modes of transportation, let's say, where the rail line crossed over Broad Street and there were several parallel tracks crossing Broad. There were daily deaths and horses getting snagged and carriages and things. It was a bad situation. So they ended up depressing the city branch below street level in the latter half of the 19th century, the latter 10 years of the 19th century. So this is actually a view looking west along the city branch showing that construction process of sinking the rail lines underground. And it's funny, almost exactly after they finished depressing the rail lines, that entire industrial corridor started trending away from its use as heavy industrial use. But this at one time was by far the heaviest industrial user of the city branch industrial freight rail line, Baldwin Locomotive Works, which was the world's leading producer of engines, train engines. So today, this is what we see when we traverse the 2.2 miles of the city branch. The upper left photo is showing the back of the Rodin Museum, which we see as an incredible opportunity to create an amazing civic space there. It is also showing there in the back, you can see there's an entrance to a tunnel. So the city branch is the majority of it is open to the sky. It's all below street level, but the majority is open to the sky, except for this 3,000-foot long tunnel that goes underneath Pennsylvania Avenue. And it's really just this stunning, remarkable space where you can see it there in the lower left corner. Underneath Pennsylvania Avenue, they were ventilation shafts, but now they kind of act as just simple light shafts where you have a lot of natural light piercing through this vast space of, it has an amazing arched masonry ceiling and a lot of other character that creates a very spiritual kind of space. And then the two images on the right are closer to the east side of the city branch, where you see how it can really just start to feel like a valley. And there are so many points in the city branch where you don't even realize that you're in a city at all. You feel like you could be just in a valley out in the suburbs somewhere, out in the wilderness, and it's really quite an experience that you just can't recreate anywhere else in the city. One of the other great opportunities that the city branch affords is that it's right next to Fairmount Park, which has something like 10 million users every year and connects to hundreds of miles of regional trail networks. So this is a shot showing you where there is an existing pedestrian bridge going over the city branch, and there is actually an active CSX rail line there on the right side, but the city branch right-of-way that we would propose to turn into a linear park and recreation path actually extends far to the left side of this photo. So it's actually much wider than what is being shown here. But that's the entrance to Fairmount Park there on the right side. So as I mentioned, almost right after the city branch was built below street level, city planners in Philadelphia started having a very different vision for the future of that part of the city. And they started planning what is now today the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, which is home to many of Philadelphia's most treasured cultural and arts institutions. And all of them have incredible numbers for visitorship annually. So this is just showing many of those destinations that are within a stone's throw of the city branch and receive, together they receive millions and millions of visitors. So while Paul is talking about the opportunity of the 9th Street branch as being somewhat of a neighborhood park and really serving those residents who don't have any green space to call their own, we see the entire 3-mile route as an opportunity to serve a number of different people, including tourists and including residents who would like to have a great recreation path to connect to some of those destinations along the way. So this is a quote we found a little, inspiring. It makes you think about the spaces that you see and don't necessarily recognize as having a civic quality or any kind of benefit to the public. But sometimes when you just see them with fresh eyes, you recognize that there is such potential there, and actually the existing character of something, a unique character of something, doesn't really need to be changed that much. And that's kind of a value we've brought into a visioning process with many community groups. But it's something that we wanted to have a dialogue about. A lot of people do really love the character of the route as it is now. And this is one of the precedents that we have shown in other presentations. This is a Sugalinde Nature Park in Berlin, where you can see there's just been a very minimal kind of intervention. There's not a lot of new elements kind of inserted into this landscape. It's really about highlighting the character of what's already there. And usually when I show this photo, it's not on the High Line, so it's usually not in New York, so people, when they see this, they're like, really? That's what the High Line looked like before? They just don't realize that it actually, the viaduct, the Reading Viaduct, the way it looks now, it looks very similar to this. It's just very, wild and has had tracks going through it. And we see that the High Line is kind of this middle ground between preserving a lot of the character and kind of telling that story, and they kept the rails, and there are a lot of other design elements that talk about the rail line's history. And then you have another precedent, the Promenade Plantée, which really feels like a total, complete transformation. You don't even really necessarily realize that it used to be a rail line when you're on the Promenade Plantée. But it's another precedent that we find very useful because it's similar to the rail park in a number of ways. For instance, it's actually 3 miles long, and it also is partially above ground and partially below street level. So that's one of the below street level part of it has been, part of the difficulty of selling the entire 3-mile route is people can't really visualize what a space that's below street level, how a space that's below street level can be a quality kind of place to be in, a place that feels safe and pleasant. So we pointed to the Promenade Plantée as a successful way of doing that. So really overall, where are we now? Right now we're really at a stage that I call cultivating consensus. Like I said, that not everyone really can imagine what a below street level public space can feel like, and we feel that community engagement and public awareness are totally critical at this stage. So we've been spending a lot of time working with community groups and having a lot of events to help bring people into our process, hear their ideas, hear their concerns, and have it really be a robust dialogue. We're also building capacity as a very small organization that's in a very nascent stage. That's something that we're working on. But really, one of our biggest pushes through the past year was we just completed a conceptual design for a segment of the city branch, partially to kind of bring some visuals into that, how do we make the city branch a nice public space. So these are just some images from an exercise that we did as a part of a big, large-scale design event in Philadelphia to try to get people to tell us what they wanted to see as a part of the project, really give us some creative ideas, and make it really fun. And through all of these conversations that we've had with various groups, we've tried to distill a set of shared values. really getting towards this idea of having a dialogue before design, and what are the things that we can all rally around, and what are the things that we can all believe in collectively, and have that form the foundation of design once we, as we develop concepts for the route. Also, part of the need of cultivating consensus is convincing the right-of-way and adjacent property owners that getting them on board. It's totally critical. So this map is showing the ownership of the route, and Paul went over some of this, but Reading International owns the Ninth Street branch, SEPTA owns the city branch, but there are a few parcels that extend over the top of the city branch at street level. So those that are publicly owned are shown in blue, and those that are privately owned are shown in gray. So those are kind of like areas that we feel could be threatened by development if the developer isn't necessarily on board with the vision. So one of those, or let me just go back for a second. Those 2 blocks directly adjacent to Broad Street, which is, as Paul mentioned, kind of our north-south civic access, were just acquired by a Philadelphia developer who proposes to build a very large casino and entertainment complex adjacent to the city branch. So his current plans propose to deck over those two blocks entirely, which we feel like would be create a pretty big barrier to having a strong connection to Broad Street, which we feel like is one of the best opportunities of the entire 3-mile site. So this developer is actually one of 6 developers vying for a second casino license in Philadelphia. So, and that process of selecting who gets the second license will go through December. So until then, we won't really know whether or not this will go forward. But that's one of the reasons why we chose to do a conceptual design for a portion of the city branch that passes by where that casino entertainment complex might be. So this is showing kind of switched orientation for you a little bit, but Broad Street there going left to right is actually our north-south kind of axis. And you'll see there's a white tower building there just north of Callowhill, where Callowhill and Broad. That is the Philadephia Inquirer building, which is where Philadelphia's principal paper was produced and published and printed for a number of years up until 1992, when the Philadephia Inquirer moved out to the suburbs. So that's part of the property that was acquired for this potential casino and entertainment complex. And you'll see that's the city branch right there next to it. So as I mentioned, we really saw the intersection with Broad Street as one of the biggest opportunities for creating a really kind of inspiring civic space. So it's right adjacent to that site. And this is also one of the reasons why we decided to do a conceptual design for this site. This is showing behind the Inquirer building, there's a bridge structure that is maintained by the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation. So they contacted us early last year and said that they had to replace this bridge structure because it was too aged and needed to be replaced. But one of their scenarios, their low-cost scenario, was actually to fill in underneath the Broad Street Bridge. So that would kind of, create a wall there in the city branch to have this continuous path going underneath Broad Street and connecting to the SEPTA spur. So, this is showing down in that pit and showing, looking east and out the other side. So along the entire 3-mile route, there is only one structure that is encroached on the right-of-way itself, and that is this 1990s addition to what is today the school district building, but was designed in 1948 by Albert Kahn as the Rotogravure building, which was actually a part of the Philadephia Inquirer newspaper complex. So the addition is just this windowless block there in the middle of that image. So if that building were not there, then you could actually walk from one end of the rail park to the other end of the rail park and continuously without having to cross a single street. So that was another part of it. This is just showing an elevation showing how the building was modified over time. There's some sensitivity there because it is a historically significant structure. And this is just showing in plan view The green areas there in the upper left are the parts of the rail park of the city branch that are open to the sky. And you can see that the infill building there between Broad Street and 15th Street is kind of filled in the right-of-way. So just taking you back to the street level, this was kind of the grand unveiling rendering that was produced as a part of this conceptual design process. We were very fortunate to have an amazing design team, all volunteer design team headed by Olin, the Olin Partnership, and Bolin, Swinsky Jackson, and CVM Engineers and VJ Associates. And they did such an incredible job, and I feel that they really highlighted the opportunity here and show what the potential is for the city branch. You can see it doesn't really feel like a scary space down there. You don't really feel like you're underground necessarily at all. And one of the more clever moves that I really appreciated, and a lot of people have kind of commented on the past few months after we unveiled these designs, is the addition of this sloping ramp in between the school district administration building on the right and Broad Street in the foreground that would kind of create this grand entrance from Broad Street itself. So this is a view from the same vantage point, looking in the same direction, but actually underneath the Broad Street Bridge, looking west. You can see they thought about how to integrate some water features, and stormwater management was definitely one of the focuses of how do we maximize the city branch's potential for stormwater management, which I'll come back to. When we initially started this process, we wanted to focus on a very small stretch of the city branch, but the design team made an excellent point that we should extend the site to include the Community College of Philadelphia campus, which is close to the top of the image there. So really creating this anchor between Broad Street and the CCP campus, which turned out to be a wonderful idea because they're about to go into their own campus master planning process. And when we met with them to share with them these ideas, they were absolutely thrilled, and they wanted to, they were really excited to integrate the concept of turning the city branch into part of their campus, because they don't really have a lot of green space. And so this is kind of showing you how that connection could be made. So this rendering is from the vantage point directly adjacent to the CCP campus. And it's maybe hard to tell because it's in the background, but what they did was they proposed stepping back the existing masonry retainer wall successively to create this terraced landscape that connects up to the CCP campus there on the left side of the image. So overall, Philadelphia has a very robust green stormwater infrastructure implementation effort going on right now through the Philadelphia Water Department, who has several $billion that they're committing towards trying to manage stormwater at street level rather than have it go into the combined sewer. So there's a huge opportunity there to tap into some implementation funds. So this one half-mile segment of the 2.2-mile long city branch could manage effectively 37 acres of street runoff catchment area, which is a tremendous amount of area. So also, just to come back to the concept of cultivating consensus, we also have been kind of at a point of disagreement with the city itself on whether the city branch should be used for a linear park or what it was originally acquired by SEPTA for, which is transit uses. So earlier this year, I should say, and Paul made mention of the Schuylkill Valley Metro, which was, this idea from the mid-90s of creating this, reestablishing a commuter rail line from Philadelphia 62 miles out to Reading, Pennsylvania. And that idea kind of fizzled out by the mid-2000s, let's say. So when this plan, as a part of the comprehensive Philadelphia 2035 plan, came out earlier this year to reintroduce some sort of transit use into the city branch, we were a little bit surprised to hear that. But now instead of light rail, they're proposing a bus rapid transit system that instead of serving primarily commuters would be serving more tourists and connecting to the zoo and the other destinations that I highlighted on that map. So once we heard that this was their plan, and we are open to visions that include both uses in a parallel way, that they could happily coexist in such a wide right-of-way. We immediately launched an advocacy campaign, an outreach campaign to our supporters to ask the Planning Commission to include the city branch as a part of a recreation and trail network in Philadelphia. And ultimately it worked, and they agreed to include it in the plan as an alternative vision for the city branch. So now, we're kind of focusing our efforts on the SEPTA spur, which is the phase 1 that Paul talked about, and we're happy to be partnered with Reading Viaduct project and other people who are strongly in support of the project and trying to raise funds for the operations budget for the first phase of the project, which is just thrilling. And that's it. You gonna say something?
Yes. So thank you so much. We are now going to have a brief period of question and answers for either of our panelists. You can just feel free to raise your hands and we'll call on you. I think it's a small enough space we can hear questions without a mic. Does anybody have any questions for Leah or Paul?
Yeah, this just happened a few weeks ago. It's all kind of fresh, and we're all kind of trying to figure out where everyone stands on that issue. But when the draft of the plan came out a few months ago, or 2 months ago, it only identified bus rapid transit as the future use of the city branch. So that's when we kind of geared up and we sent out mass emails and asked our supporters to write to the Planning Commission and ask them to reconsider that position, and which they ultimately did. I have not seen, they haven't released the final version of the plan yet, but I have assurances from the Planning Commission that they did include our vision within that document. Did that answer your question? Yeah.
I'm wondering what kind of funding sources, you said you're going to start exploring fundraising. What kind of funding sources you're going to be looking for?
Well, for the first phase, which is the portion we're working on, we had 2 local foundations fund the preliminary design, and then the city itself, through us, funded the creation of construction documents. So we've had foundations in the city funding this first phase. The next phase of the capital side, we're expecting to go for state dollars, local foundation dollars, and private as well. And I think we're in a different situation in that we are an organization that has built a lot of things. So we're going one model. Leah's organization's done great civic engagement to build public support. So it's sort of 2 very different models of how you move something forward.
Well, I think also when you include the entire 3 miles that ultimately connects to a regional trail network, it opens up the door to a number of different funding sources where it's not just funding for open space, but it's funding for alternative transportation and regional trail networks. There are a number of funding sources that would be interested in supporting expanding Philadelphia's trail network.
Sorry. Great presentation. Paul, I'm curious Olin did your designs. Leah, Paul, who did your designs?
Yeah, there's a relatively small landscape design community. So Leah mentioned Olin Partnership, who was the lead landscape designer for us for the Dilworth Plaza project. One of the people who started his own firm, a young fellow named Brian Haynes, did the initial design for us in Sister Cities. We retained him and Urban Engineers to do the Reading Viaduct portion. So Brian has his firm right across the street looking out the window, so we get great aerial views as well. Other questions? Gentleman here in the back, I think there.
We come to you.
Just bring the mic.
So you've talked about stage 1 with the SEPTA spur. Do you have a sense of the timeline for the raised Reading Viaduct part that goes up to Fairmont, or is that still up in the air?
when you do projects like this, you learn patience over time. I think we can realistically predict the first phase within the next year or two is going to be simply subject to our ability to raise funds. And while I don't want to say 7 or 8 million is a small number, it's not a huge and daunting number. I think the second phase, part of what we are doing in phase one is if you build a piece of it, as you did here in New York City, people were skeptical about phase one, and phase one made phase two and phase three inevitable. People said, well, of course we've got to do the rest. So one, we're starting small. I think we have a significant hurdle, which I just alluded to, which is Reading International, who we are in conversation with. This project here is our greatest friend and our worst enemy. It's our greatest friend because we've all been inspired by what can happen, and the remarkable development you have going around here has the current owner of that portion saying, there's millions of dollars in this project for us, and that's making them much more slowly. 10 years ago, they would have given the land to us. Now they see a gold mine. So we have a delicate negotiating process. I would say if we get phase one done, there are forms of persuasion that the city can bring to bear. I would say it's 5 years away before we're in phase two. Other questions? If there's extra money here in New York, Leah and I would be glad to take some of it back to Philadelphia if you want to volunteer.
Any last questions? Okay, let's give another round of applause to Leah Murphy and Paul Levy, please. So before we announce the raffle, I just want to thank a few really important organizations that help make this possible. First of all, the Seed Fund that provides funding for Beyond the High Line, and also for our partners at Next City who are actually here today. Would the representatives from Next City like to say hello? Just say, if you have any questions for them, you can feel free. Just a little bit about Next City. It's a 501c3 media organization, and their goal is to promote socially and environmentally sustainable economic growth in cities and examine how and why our built environment, economy, society, and culture are changing. And they're actually covering all of our talks through blogs on their website, which is nextcity.org. So make sure you check them out. They have a lot of really fabulous articles about urban life. So I want to plug, once again, the other two talks. The next one is July 15th, and it's with Majora Carter and Enrique Peñalosa. And as Robert mentioned, that's going to be a really fabulous talk. We hope you'll come out for it. And then the following one is September 23rd, and it's about Fresh Kills Landfill in Staten Island, which is really close to home and a really exciting project. So thank you all so much for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.